Do you know what's more terrifying than the death of someone you love? It's the silence that follows. This house once brimmed with laughter, with gentle disagreements, with the notes Arthur would play drifting from the room at the end of the hall. And now? The armchair is still there, bearing the familiar indentation where he used to sit. The grandfather clock still ticks methodically, as if nothing has changed in its inanimate world. But he, my Arthur, has vanished, dissolved into the void like a melody just ended. I am Eleanor. And this is my story, about listening within that profound stillness. Listening for a sound that perhaps, at first, only my heart could discern. A forgotten note, left behind amidst the fragments of a life, yearning to be heard, like a whisper from the other side of silence. That silence, it had a weight of its own, an almost tangible presence. It wasn't just the absence of Arthur's voice, his laughter. It seeped into the very grain of the floorboards, into every fold of the curtains, and settled in my chest like a block of ice. I moved through that silence, unconsciously straining to hear. To hear if there truly was a whisper, some sign from him, amidst the steady, soulless ticking of the grandfather clock and the sound of my own sighs. The world outside, of course, remained noisy in its own way, telephones still shrilled with the demands of daily life. But here, within these four walls, time seemed to stand still, holding its breath, waiting. Until another sound, a sharp and unexpected note, tore through that fragile membrane of quiet. It's a particular kind of cruelty, isn't it, to be told your grief is an inconvenience? An imposition. 3 weeks after Arthur, my husband of 42 years, drew his last breath, my own sister, Caroline, found the words. Your grief is becoming a bit performative, Eleanor, she'd said, her voice like chilled wine over the phone. It's making people uncomfortable. As if my heart, shattered into 1,000 unswept pieces, was merely a social faux pas. Her words, precise and dismissive, had become another layer to the silence in the house Arthur and I had shared. A silence already so dense, it felt like a new inhabitant, one who echoed Caroline's judgment in the hollow tick of the grandfather clock in the hall, Arthur's clock, stubbornly marking time that no longer held him. I sat now in his worn leather armchair, his half-finished book of poetry open in my lap, the verses a blur. His scent, pipe tobacco and old paper, usually a comfort, today felt like an accusation. Was I performing this, too? This quiet ache, this ritual of remembrance? The actual phone call had been about the memorial service, ostensibly. Caroline, ever the pragmatist, was firming up numbers. But between the lines about canapés and flower arrangements, the true agenda had emerged. We need to be mindful of appearances, dear, she'd cautioned, her tone softening into that familiar condescension she reserved for my perceived impracticalities. And then, the carefully delivered blow about my performative sorrow. I hadn't argued then. I'd murmured something indistinct, the receiver cold against my ear. What I had done was remember Arthur himself, 6 months prior, convulsed with laughter at some ridiculous television show, tears of pure, unself-conscious joy streaming down his face as he gasped, Ellie, isn't life preposterous? His joy hadn't been performative. It had simply been Arthur. Unfiltered, robust, wonderfully alive. The memory, sharp and bright, was a painful contrast to Caroline's careful, curated world, and the small, hot seed of a rebellion I didn't yet recognize began to warm itself in the chill of her disapproval. The following days were a blur of well-meaning casseroles I barely touched and condolence cards with generic, comforting script. I moved through the house like a swimmer in deep water, each task an effort. Sorting Arthur's desk, a place that had always hummed with the quiet energy of his research, felt like an archaeological dig into my own heart. Tucked beneath a stack of astronomy journals, I found it, the glossy auction catalog for the upcoming Art and Soul Gala, the town's annual charity fundraiser. Arthur usually skimmed these things, tootaying at the prices, but this one had a sticky note peeking from page 12. I almost set it aside, but the bright yellow of the note caught my eye. I flipped it open. Item 37, an antique brass refractor telescope, circa 1890, rumored to have belonged to Professor Alastair Finch. A photograph showed a beautiful, formidable instrument, gleaming under studio lights. It was undoubtedly handsome. But it was the loose sheet of paper tucked beside it, Arthur's familiar spidery handwriting covering a page from his ideas notebook, that made my breath catch. F/5.5. Achromatic doublet. Original mountings? Query lens condition. Potential for stunning lunar detail. A. Finch, the one who charted the Orion Nebula deviations? Worth investigating. Below, a quick, surprisingly deft sketch of the telescope, and beside it, scrawled in the margin almost as an afterthought, "One day, Ellie, for our stars." A wave of profound tenderness washed over me. Our stars. It wasn't just an instrument, it was a shared dream, a testament to those quiet nights we'd spent in the backyard, him patiently pointing out constellations, me bundled in a blanket, feigning more understanding than I possessed, simply happy to be near his enthusiasm. This telescope, or one like it, had been a quiet, persistent hope of his, a thing of beauty and intellectual adventure he'd deferred for more practical expenses. I traced the sketch with a fingertip, the memory of his hand guiding mine to the focus knob of his battered beginner scope suddenly vivid. Later that week, Caroline called again, her voice buoyant. "Just back from the pre-auction viewing at the gallery, Eleanor. Utterly packed. And you'll never guess what I've set my heart on, that charming old telescope. Isn't it divine? It would look simply perfect in the north corner of my library, a real conversation piece. I imagine it's quite valuable, but one must support the arts, mustn't one?" I gripped the edge of Arthur's desk. "It is rather striking," I managed, my voice carefully neutral. "Striking indeed," Caroline chirped. "Well, I must dash. Just wanted to share my little find. I expect quite the bidding war, but I'm rather determined." She hung up. I stared at Arthur's notes again. His telescope. His stars. And Caroline, who likely wouldn't know Orion from a soup ladle, wanted it for her library's aesthetic. That old, hot anger, the one I'd felt after her earlier call, rekindled, but this time it was sharper, clearer, with a definite point of focus. The town of Seaview Bluffs might see a bidding war, I thought, but they wouldn't know the real stakes. Only Arthur and I did. And now, it seemed, I was the sole keeper of that particular flame. A resolve, cool and quiet, began to crystallize within me. The Art and Soul Gala was the highlight of Seaview Bluff's meager social calendar, and the silent auction its glittering centerpiece. For years, Arthur and I had attended, mostly for the passable wine and the people watching. He'd always made a token bid on some local artist's watercolor, something small and unassuming. The idea of me, Eleanor Vance, engaging in a serious bidding war felt as alien as astrophysics, yet the thought had taken root, tenacious as the dandelions Arthur patiently tolerated in our lawn. First, there was the matter of funds. We'd lived comfortably but not extravagantly. Arthur's pension was adequate, and there was a modest life insurance policy, for a rainy day or a wild dream, he'd said with a wink when he first took it out. Rain had certainly come. Perhaps this was the wild dream, a celestial one at that. I spent an afternoon with bank statements and old policy documents, the numbers swimming before my eyes. It would be a stretch, a significant portion of what was left. This wasn't just about an object, it was about the weight of Arthur's unspoken wish, the echo of our stars. The thought made my hands tremble slightly as I wrote down a figure on a notepad, the absolute maximum I could justify. It felt reckless, defiant. It felt right. Is this foolish, Eleanor? Spending this much? For memory? But what is memory if not the truest part of what remains? Caroline will have caterers and florists for the memorial, all tasteful. Arthur would have wanted the stars. My preparation was quiet, almost furtive. I didn't consult with Caroline, of course. I did, however, call the gallery and inquire, with feigned casualness, about the process for absentee bidding, just in case I couldn't make the evening. The young woman on the phone, chipper and helpful, explained the forms. I even found myself at the local library, not in the poetry section, but amidst dusty astronomy tomes, trying to decipher Arthur's notes on achromatic doublets. The librarian, Mrs. Gable, a contemporary of mine with kind, knowing eyes, raised an eyebrow. Taking up a new hobby, Eleanor? She'd asked. I'd merely smiled and said Arthur had always found the universe so fascinating. A small, almost imperceptible shift began within me, a quiet tending to a part of Arthur's world I'd only ever observed from the periphery. The evening before the gala, Caroline called, her voice a buzz. Darling, are you sure you won't come with Charles and me? It'll be a crush, but terribly amusing. I've already spotted at least 3 other women who clearly have their eye on my telescope. But don't worry, I have a strategy. I'm still not feeling up to a crowd, Caroline, I said, my voice even. Inside, a small, cold knot of anticipation tightened. But you enjoy yourself. Oh, I intend to, she trilled. One simply must acquire the things that speak to one's soul, mustn't one? Even if they cost a pretty penny. Her soul, I thought wryly after hanging up, probably spoke fluent Tiffany. Mine, it seemed, was whispering about sidereal mechanics and the price of keeping a promise, even one only sketched in a faded notebook. That night, sleep was elusive. The house felt enormous, the silence punctuated only by the grandfather clock's erratic heartbeat. I held Arthur's notebook, the paper soft from his touch, and felt not just grief, but a strange, nervous excitement. A fight, as Velma might have said if she were here. I had almost forgotten what that felt like. The Seaview Bluffs Community Arts Center buzzed with a particular kind of manufactured energy. Wine flowed a little too freely, laughter sounded a shade too bright, and the scent of expensive perfume mingled with the faint, hopeful aroma of canapes. I clutched my auction paddle, number 27, an anonymous number for an anonymous bidder if I chose, and found a quiet alcove near the back, slightly shadowed, from which I could observe without being too prominent. Caroline, naturally, was near the front, a constellation of local magnates and busybodies orbiting her. She wore a sharp silk dress the color of new money and occasionally waved her own paddle, number 7, with a proprietary air. My heart beat a steady, determined rhythm against my ribs. This wasn't about the money, not really. It was about Arthur's faded notes, about our stars, about the quiet spaces where real value resided, far from this glittering charade. Item after item went under the hammer, a gaudy abstract painting, a weekend at a spa, a set of antique silver whose history no one present likely knew or cared about. Then, the auctioneer, a man with an overly enthusiastic smile and a booming voice, announced, and now, ladies and gentlemen, item number 37. A magnificent piece of scientific history, a truly remarkable antique brass refractor telescope, circa 1890. A murmur went through the room. Caroline straightened, her smile fixed. The bidding started briskly. I let Caroline make the first few bids, watching her almost casual confidence. When the price reached a level that I knew was already beyond mere whim, I gave the subtle nod I'd prearranged with a gallery volunteer stationed nearby, who then signaled my bid. Caroline's head turned slightly, a flicker of surprise in her eyes as she saw the volunteer's signal, not knowing whose it was. She countered. I nodded again. The room grew quieter. It became a 2-person race, unseen opponent versus Caroline's very visible, increasingly less casual assertions. The numbers climbed. Higher than Arthur's notes had ever anticipated. Higher than my careful budget. My palms were damp. This was no longer just about the telescope, it was a silent, internal reckoning. Each nod I gave was an affirmation of Arthur's passion, a rebuttal to Caroline's dismissal of my grief, a quiet reclaiming of what truly mattered. I thought of Arthur's words about appearances, about the simple joy of discovery. This money, it was just paper, what it could do, what it could mean, that was real. When the bidding reached a sum that made even Caroline hesitate, her smile faltering for a split second, I took a deep breath and gave one final, decisive nod. The auctioneer paused dramatically. Going once, going twice. He scanned the room. Caroline fanned herself lightly with her paddle but did not raise it. Sold, he boomed, his gavel cracking the expectant air. To bidder number 27. A polite smattering of applause. Caroline pasted on a gracious smile, turning to congratulate someone beside her on their earlier purchase of a ceramic dog. I remained in my alcove, my heart finally slowing. Then, before the next item could be announced, I stood and walked towards the small podium, my legs steadier than I expected. The auctioneer looked surprised. "Excuse me," I said, my voice clear and carrying surprisingly well in the sudden hush. Item 37, the telescope. I'm bidder number 27. All eyes turned to me, including Caroline's, wide and uncomprehending. And I would like to announce that this wonderful instrument is being donated, effective immediately, to the Seaview Bluffs Community College Observatory. I paused, then added, my voice softening, in perpetual memory of my late husband, Arthur Vance, a man who believed the stars belonged to everyone, and who spent his life inviting others to look up. Another silence, deeper this time. Then, someone started to clap, then another, and soon the room was filled with a genuine, warm applause that had nothing to do with polite auction etiquette. I saw Caroline's face. Just for a moment, her perfectly constructed composure fractured, revealing something raw and stunned beneath. Then it was gone. I didn't care. I looked towards the spot where the telescope had been displayed, imagining it under a vast, dark sky, aimed towards Orion, or perhaps a newly discovered comet. Arthur would have liked that. He really would have. The buzz of the auction faded almost immediately for me after my announcement. There were a few surprised congratulations, a slightly flustered handshake from the gallery director, but Caroline was notably absent from the well-wishers. I saw her across the room, near the exit, her back to me, engaged in an overly animated conversation with someone whose face I didn't recognize. She didn't look back. It was a dismissal, of sorts, but one that no longer carried any sting. My focus, my heart, had already moved on. The following week was filled with quiet, purposeful activity. I met with Dr. Eris Thorne, the head of Seaview Bluffs Community College's modest physics department. He was a man perhaps a few years younger than Arthur would have been, with kind, intelligent eyes that lit up when he spoke of distant galaxies. He remembered Arthur from a public lecture series years ago. A keen mind, your husband, he said, shaking my hand warmly. Always asked the most insightful questions. His words were a balm. There was no red tape, no fuss. The college was overjoyed, their existing observatory equipment dated and sorely in need of an upgrade. Together, Dr. Thorne and I chose a spot in the small, domed observatory on the hill behind the campus, a place with an uninterrupted view of the night sky over the Pacific. Watching two careful college maintenance workers gently maneuver the gleaming brass telescope onto its new, solid platform, I felt a pang that was more sweet than sorrowful. It looked right here. It belonged. A few days later, a simple brass plaque was affixed below it, in loving memory of Arthur Vance, 1950 to 2023, keep looking up. Dr. Thorne had invited me for the unofficial unveiling. No crowd, just him, a shy, bright-eyed physics student named Maria who helped manage the observatory, and myself. He would have loved this, Mrs. Vance, Maria said, her voice soft with an earnestness that reminded me a little of Arthur himself when he was trying to explain the beauty of a nebula to me. She gestured towards the eyepiece. Would you like to be the first? I hesitated, then nodded. My hand, when I reached for the focus knob, was steady. Maria expertly aimed it towards Jupiter, a bright beacon in the early evening sky. I leaned in, and there it was, the planet swimming into focus, a pale, striped jewel, its Galilean moons like tiny pinpricks of diamond dust beside it. Arthur had shown them to me countless times through his old, less powerful scope, his voice filled with an almost boyish wonder. Seeing them now, so crisp and clear, felt like hearing his voice again, a clear, joyful echo across the silence. I stayed there for a long time, lost in the vastness, feeling a profound sense of peace settle over me, a quiet culmination. The stars, Arthur's stars, our stars, were exactly where they should be. Several months drifted by, soft as summer fog over Seaview Bluffs. The raw edge of grief had softened, not disappeared, but settled into a deeper, quieter current within me. I found myself taking out Arthur's old astronomy books, not just dusting them, but actually reading them, his pencil marks in the margins like quiet conversations. I even started attending the community college's occasional public stargazing nights at the observatory, standing at the back, an anonymous face in the small crowd, listening to Dr. Thorne or young Maria explain the constellations. Sometimes, I'd take a turn at the Arthur Vance telescope. Each time, it felt like a quiet salute. The annual family Thanksgiving dinner was held at Caroline's that year. It was, as always, impeccably organized, the table groaning under a tasteful bounty. Throughout the meal, Caroline was her usual self, managing, directing, offering critiques thinly veiled as helpful suggestions. But when I spoke, sharing a small, amusing anecdote about a student I'd overheard at the observatory misidentifying Mars, she listened. Actually listened. There was no patronizing smile, no impatient interruption. Later, as I was helping clear plates, she paused beside me in the kitchen. "That was a remarkable thing you did, Eleanor," she said, her voice unusually low, not quite meeting my eye. "With the telescope. Arthur would have been very proud." She turned and walked away before I could respond, leaving me with the faint scent of her expensive perfume and a new, unaccustomed silence between us, not the old, brittle silence of unspoken grievances, but something almost respectful. I didn't need her approval anymore, not in the way I once might have craved some sign of familial understanding. But the words, unexpected as they were, settled gently, like the first feathery snowflakes of winter, not melting the old drifts entirely, but softening their harsh outlines. My universe, the one I had painstakingly reassembled from the fragments of my old life and the light of Arthur's enduring love, was truly my own now. That evening, back in the quiet of Arthur's armchair, I didn't reach for his poetry. Instead, I looked out the window at the vast, diamond-strewn canvas of the night sky. Arcturus winked knowingly, a familiar friend. I thought of Caroline's grudging words, of Maria's bright enthusiasm, of Arthur's penciled notes. My grief for him was a part of that vastness now, not a suffocating blanket, but a constellation of cherished memories, each one a fixed point of light. I closed my eyes and smiled, a genuine, private smile that reached all the way to my bones. I was no longer just the woman Arthur had left behind. I was Eleanor Vance, keeper of stars, teller of her own story, finally looking up. Sometimes, the best way to honor a memory isn't to hold on to it tightly, but to share its light. What stars will you look up to tonight? Thank you for joining Eleanor's journey. Subscribe for more stories that find the extraordinary in the everyday.